Okay, in this screencast, I'm going to be talking about antibiotics and how they work against bacteria. And then we will get into as well how bacteria have evolved to develop resistance to these antibiotics over time. But first, let's start by just looking at how antibiotics work on bacteria. So we know antibiotics are what you take if you catch a pathogenic bacteria. So something like strep throat or pneumonia, something that is bacterial in nature, and the doctor will prescribe you antibiotics. And what those antibiotics do, depending on the type of antibiotics, they're going to interfere with the metabolism of bacteria. And bacteria, we know, are prokaryotic cells. They're living organisms. They're a single-celled organism. They don't have a nucleus. They're prokaryotic, right? And those antibiotics, depending on what kind, are going to interfere with some of the chemical reactions and the enzymes involved in the metabolism of bacteria. So, like, if bacteria needs to copy their DNA, there's certain enzymes that help with that. And these types of like ciprofloxacin and others will interfere with their ability to copy their DNA. Some will interfere with the ability for bacteria to make a cell wall. So you can see penicillins and other things will do that. There's some that will interfere with their ability to make viable proteins, so protein synthesis. So you can see tetracyclines and others in that regard. You don't need to know what each of these antibiotics do, but just realize that what antibiotics do is they're going to block important processes in a bacterial cell that keeps them from either dividing through binary fission or making important proteins that they need to survive. So you can see antibiotics work on the metabolism, and metabolism is the sum of the chemical reactions in an organism. So the antibiotics block the metabolism of bacteria, of prokaryotic organisms. They don't block the metabolism in you, so it doesn't stop your cells from functioning, but it does stop these prokaryotic cells from functioning. And one thing you'll note is that antibiotics, they don't work against viruses. And the reason why they don't work against viruses is because viruses, they're not living organisms. They don't have a metabolism. And so antibiotics don't work against viruses. They only work against bacteria. They don't work against protozoans, which are eukaryotic. They don't work against viruses, but they only work against the prokaryotic pathogenic bacteria. Well, they'll work against even non-pathogenic bacteria, but when we take them, that's what we're aiming for. Okay, so it's very important for you to know that antibiotics work for bacteria, but not for viruses. And so there's a reason why that's important, why they put that in the syllabus, is because sometimes, and in the past, before we understood how bacteria would evolve and behave, doctors and veterinarians and others, they were over prescribing antibiotics for just kind of everything. So we were popping antibiotics for everything, whether we knew it was a bacterial infection or not. But what's happened is we have found that bacteria have managed to actually evolve, and many strains of bacteria have become resistant to antibiotics, which is dangerous because if you get a strain of bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics, the antibiotics won't be effective, and it's hard for us to get over that bacterial infection with medicine. And so now that we're aware of this issue, that's why the doctor will usually give you a blood test before they prescribe antibiotics, because they want to make sure it's bacterial in nature, because they don't want to overprescribe antibiotics if they don't have to. Because not only have some bacteria become resistant to some types of antibiotics, there's some types of bacteria that have evolved multiple resistance to multiple antibiotics, and that's very dangerous. When you hear about MERS, the multiple resistant strains of bacteria in a hospital or something like that, it's very dangerous, because if someone gets infected with that, it can be almost impossible to treat it and treat it in time for someone to not get very, very sick and debilitated or even die. what you need to be able to do with this is you need to be able to actually talk about the evolution of bacteria to antibiotics and how that works through the principles of natural selection. So we're going to do a quick little recap on natural selection. And the principles of it, since we haven't actually done that yet in our class. So I'm going to visit some of these principles of natural selection. So when you talk about the evolution of bacteria through natural selection, you'll see how you need to frame it. Okay, if you were answering an essay question or something along those lines. So the first, natural selection itself is the process in which organisms with some inherited characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce than organisms that have different characteristics. And so if individuals have certain traits that give them an advantage in their environment, they will survive and reproduce more frequently than the individuals that don't have those traits. And over many, many generations, that natural selection can lead to the actually evolution of a species. So how does this apply to bacteria? First, here's the principles of natural selection, the way you would want to frame this. There has to be variation within a species. So species have to have some sort of genetic differences between them. We know there's variation in, with humans, we've got, some people are taller and shorter. And so same with bacteria. Even similar strains of bacteria will have some slight variations, usually due to mutations. Then we generally see over-reproduction, meaning more individuals are going to be born than can survive. And there's going to be some sort of selective pressure. That selective pressure could be competition or limited resources. And the individuals that are able to survive and reproduce more frequently within the confines of this selective pressure, they are the ones who are going to survive and reproduce. And so their offspring will have those same characteristics. The ones who don't have those characteristics aren't going to survive and reproduce. And so the survival and reproduction depends in that certain environment, that selective pressure. Those ones will survive and the other ones won't. And since characteristics are heritable over time, we can see the change or the evolution in these species. So let's take a look at what that means in antibiotic resistance. So the first one, we've got variation of characteristics from the species. So let's say an individual comes down with a bacterial pneumonia, and populating their lungs is a population of bacteria that is causing the pneumonia. And within almost any population, especially bacteria that can reproduce pretty quickly, there's probably going to be some mutations and some variation. And so this population of bacteria living in this person's lungs that's starting to make them sick has a few individuals that have a mutation that's just happened randomly because they divide so quickly, have a mutation that actually make them resistant to some bacteria or some antibiotics. So these live in your lungs. They're reproducing quickly. Some mutations that happen randomly have caused a mutation. So we have variation in the population. We have the bacterial strain, that pneumonia strain that can, that's kind of the more common strain, but there's a couple of variations, a couple of mutations that have randomly occurred to confer some resistant bacteria. All right, now, so with this reproduction, there's lots and lots that have multiplied. And then what happens is there's some sort of selective pressure that is introduced. And in this case, the selective pressure is the individual feels sick enough now, they're going to go to the doctor and get some antibiotics. And so the doctor might, prescribe them like 10 days worth of antibiotics to take. Those antibiotics have now changed the environment within that person's lungs because the antibiotics are working to interfere with the metabolism of that bacteria. So of all that pneumonia bacteria. So the selective pressure is the antibiotics, okay? So the antibiotics have changed that environment. It's caused a new selective pressure. And the individuals that already had the mutation that made them so they are not susceptible to being killed by the antibiotics, those ones are going to survive and reproduce. So you see, The antibiotics have killed off almost all of these guys, but the ones that were able to survive in that new environment were the ones that had resistance, the ones that had that variation. And maybe the individual stopped taking their antibiotics a little bit early. And so it didn't, where it might have killed these if they took the full dose, but because they didn't quite take the full dose of 10 days, that those ones were able to survive the fewer antibiotics that person took. And they can survive and they reproduce. And you notice now the new strain that keeps reproducing in that individual's lungs are the ones that were resistant to that. And you can see all of their offspring, when they reproduce, have that resistance as well. So over time, the genetic makeup of this population has changed towards the more resistant phenotype. Okay. One thing that's very important, is that you realize that the antibiotics are the selective pressure. They have changed the environment. The antibiotics were not the mutagen that caused the variation in the first place. That was just random because bacteria, they reproduce really quickly. So mutations happen quite often. And so maybe they didn't really have an advantage in the normal environment. But as soon as someone started taking antibiotics, that's the selective pressure. That's the environment that changed. And that's what gave these two bacteria an advantage in that environment versus the other ones. Okay, so hopefully that helps you get through explaining the evolution of bacteria and resistant to antibiotics.